Okay. I think we should start, otherwise we'll have even less time than has been scheduled. It's my great pleasure to introduce the panel today. I think you've probably heard them all speak several times already, so I won't go into their individual bios, which are all very impressive. To my right, Ashraf al-Ajrami will be talking about, this is a session which is going to be looking at the degree to which religion is part of the problem of the conflict in the region. And for many centuries, in some ways, it was part of the solution. It kept stability, but something has obviously changed. So I'm very excited to have Ashraf al-Ajrami, who, along with Seidemann and Matti Steinberg, talking about the role that religion is playing today in intensifying the conflict. I'd like to start from left to right. So, Danny, if you could begin.
What's the question?
The question is, does the combination of nationalism and religion mean that the conflict is moving away from a territorial dispute into a religious paradigm? And what does this mean for Israel's security?
Okay, let me begin by saying that the faith dimension of this conflict has probably been the most bungled and mismanaged, probably because of people like me who are devoutly secular. Most of the policymakers are tone deaf to the siren call of faith in Jerusalem. You have a bunch of yuppies from Ramallah talking to yuppies from Tel Aviv, talking to yuppies from the Beltway in Washington, and they just don't get it. And it was many years of my work in Jerusalem before I began to realize that one has an inadequate understanding of the conflict without understanding the faith dimension of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Any agreement that does not adequately address the concerns of faith communities will be a bad agreement, and that the decision makers are singularly unprepared for that. And one ignores these issues at your peril. That is specifically the case in Jerusalem. If one looks at the old city and the visual basin around the old city as real estate, one is doing one's job poorly. Whether you are a believer or not, this area is basically the primordial materials of the book of Genesis. It is a depository of sacred and secular memory. And one cannot address the conflict without empathetically understanding that, and until we do so, we will be alienating potential allies in faith communities throughout the world. Most of the enemies of the political process invoke religion, but most of the people of faith in the world are not hostile to these, and we have not addressed their concerns. One cannot say, keep religion out of Jerusalem. The equivalent is the equivalent of saying, keep culture out of Florence or keep finance out of Manhattan. Jerusalem is Jerusalem because of God, whether she exists or not. And you cannot understand the city without factoring that in. I don't want to wax romantic, but historically, very often, Jerusalem was the counter paradigm of clash of civilizations. For me, the quintessential place in Jerusalem to see this is at the fourth station of the cross on Al-Wad Street, which was actually stolen by the Armenian Catholics a few years ago, ripped out of the wall, and moved 100 yards closer to their souvenir stand. It's one of the dirty little secrets of the Latin Church. One can see, at any given time, Orthodox worshippers using that route to go to the Western Wall, Muslim worshippers to Aram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, and Christian pilgrims along the stations of the cross. It was never touchy-feely, it was never fuzzy warm, and when people looked at each other, often it was with contempt, but it worked. and Jerusalem spoke in its multiple voices. And that had the backing of traditional religious establishments for the most part. When I talk about the traditional establishments, I'm talking about the Vatican, the Latins, the Greek Orthodox, the traditional Protestant churches, the chief rabbinate, the Sharia courts. They supported a Jerusalem, or were sensitive to a Jerusalem that spoke in multiple voices, not because they're liberal, for the most part they're not, but because several hundreds, if not thousands of years of history has taught us that when one group has hegemony in Jerusalem, it's hell for everybody else. And that maintaining some kind of sober balance between the different communities is absolutely essential. What we have been witnessing in recent years is the ascendancy, not of religion, but the ascendancy of those faith communities that I say call weaponized faith. Those whose claims are exclusionary, absolutist, and insist on a Jerusalem that speaks in one voice. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims, I believe, are guilty of this. One can see this in the ascendancy of the settler movement, which is inspired to a certain extent by Messianism. Certainly by the Temple Mount movement, which began as a lunatic fringe, continued as a fringe, and now has gone mainstream in Israel, with clear aspirations to change the status quo on the Temple Mount and staking claims that were never made before by Jews, not over the last millennia. You have the ascendancy of radical Islam, and I'm sure Matti will address that and is much more familiar with it than I am, of the Islamic movement, partially in political terms, partially in terms of almost a cultural mood, again, seeing the conflict through the lens of a religious conflict between Islam and others. And then you have the ascendancy of the end-of-days churches, the dispensationalists. Not all evangelicals, but many evangelicals see Jerusalem as an Armageddon playground. And Sarah Palin can see the Temple Mount from her front porch in Alaska. This is, in many ways, marginalizing the traditional establishments. The chief rabbinate of Israel is very moderate on the question of a Jewish prayer in the Temple Mount, but they've been marginalized by radical rabbis, and it is, in this recent round of violence, it's clearly one of the major engines driving this round of violence were real or perceived perceptions to threat to the status quo on the Temple Mount. I believe that they are both real and perceived and fantasy, a mix of the three. But clearly, a part of the motivation was a fear that Israel was undertaking radical changes in the status quo, and not the decisive factor in this round of violence, but clearly a contributing one. These, for me, contain the seeds, I don't want to overstate this, the seeds of the morphing of a political conflict that in the past was political, that was fed and informed by religion and faith, morphing into a combination of jihad, holy war, milchemet mitzvah, Armageddon, second coming, hopefully in that order, and then we can all pack our bags and go home. Namely, the morphing of a political conflict which can be addressed by mortal men and women into an absolutist conflict that cannot be solved. I don't think we are there yet, but I do think that the dangers of that exist, and they exist both within the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities.
Thank you, Danny. You did a very good job of keeping to time, largely because I didn't set one. But you did a very good job of keeping to time, largely because I didn't set one. Time. Matti, if you could address the same question in sort of 6 or 7 minutes, that would be great.
Religion, Islamic religion, is very important in the eyes, in the Arab mind, in the Palestinian mind. There is no question. But as it is in Christianity and Judaism, you can't speak about the Islam. There is no one Islam. there is a spectrum, a whole spectrum of interpretations. There are Islams, and you have to make differentiation. Now, let me deal, of course, the subject, it's too broad to deal with it even in a seminar of a year in the university. But let me focus on the differences between Fatah as embodying what can be called with the secular conception and Hamas, the religious or fundamentalist conception. Arafat was very pious. He actually, when he was young, he was enrolled in the Muslim Brothers in Gaza. But when he established Fatah at the end of the 50s, he established it as mostly an organization which will be the Palestinian national movement, and the emphasis is on national. It was based on Palestinian nationalism, based on the Palestinian territory. It means Palestine. In those times, all Palestine. Palestinians, as it is written stated in the Palestinian Covenant, Palestinians are those who came from the territory of Palestine. So the national identity is dependent upon a secular component, which is territory and not religion. But he didn't discard, of course, religion. He was very religious from, you can call it, in contrast to the fundamentalist, he was conformist for religious. He was established religious, and he was very devout. Now, in Fatah ideology and strategy, Islamic religion is a component within Palestinian nationalism, as part of it. It is dependent upon, first of all, on the primary component of Palestinian nationalism. It means that Islamic religion must be explained, interpreted, according to the primary component, nationalism. For this reason, of course, Jerusalem and Temple Mount, or al-Haram al-Sharif, was very, very dear in the eyes of Arafat. If I'm skipping to, let us say, to the year 99, 2000, or before that, yes, let us go to Camp David. The strategic trade-off of Arafat was between the Temple Mount and the refugees. And the moment that Israel, headed by Barak, demanded sovereignty on Temple Mount, this strategic build-up, this strategic structure collapsed. And Camp David collapsed. Camp David collapsed not on the refugees. It collapsed on the demand of Israel for sovereignty on Temple Mount. And within the discussions, there was raised also building a synagogue on Temple Mount. So he could justify the biggest concession on the refugee problem. It means that they will not return to the state of Palestine only by focusing on the Temple Mount. And for him, the Temple Mount was not mainly what was important for him. Of course, what was important is, of course, his attitude toward religion, but this was not the essence. The essence was that a Palestinian state on only less than 22% of Palestine, with a separation, geographical separation between Gaza and the West Bank, such a Palestinian state would be very miserable. The only thing that can give it importance, centrality, is Temple Mount. And more than that, it has its economic, social economic advantages, because it will attract Muslims from all over the world to the Temple Mount. And then the Palestinian state, this miserable Palestinian state, would be very, very important in the world. Otherwise, it is doomed to be in great misery. Now, let us go to the Hamas. For the Hamas, it's vice versa. Religion is the primary concern, the primary factor, the determining factor, Islamic religion. While nationalism, they opened a door to nationalism, and the very creation of the Hamas in the first year of the first Intifada was a kind of an adjustment of the Hamas to the concept of Palestinian nationalism, but as a dependent variable to the independent variable, which is Islam. Hamas looks at the conflict as a religious conflict. It is a religious conflict, and all Palestine, according to its charter, is an endowment, a waqf territory. A waqf, it means an endowment, an Islamic endowment. The ownership is the ownership of Islam. So, Palestinian nationalism is important, but secondary in the conception of the Hamas until today. Until today. The Hamas, you have to bear in mind, is the Palestinian wing or branch or offspring of the Muslim Brothers. So this is the most important difference between the secular stream or the Fatah and the Hamas. May I have 2 minutes or no?
1 minute.
1 minute. Now, what is the difference now between Hamas and ISIS and Daesh and Al-Qaeda? Because for all of them, Islamic religion is most important. But for ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the loyalty to Islam is exclusive. They don't accept any loyalty to any nationalism, to any state, except for the Islamic State, which is based only on religion. And the Sharia is the constitution of this state, must be. And an Islamic State may be or must be a nucleus for building the whole caliphate. Now, the difference is that these groups are against nationalism, while Hamas opens a door for nationalism, provided, as I said. This is a big difference. Now, what is occurring now, and I have to mention it, according to the last polls, reliable polls, there is a growing audience, supporting Daesh in Gaza. It approaches now 15%, which is a huge number, compared to the past. And of course, this number gains strength out of the situation of nothing to lose in Gaza. These groups, which marginal groups, with these sects, like Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and its new name, it's Islamic State, these groups are thriving on a situation of chaos, of instability. First of all, they are trying to create it. Secondly, they are trying to seize upon it. And if you look at the areas where they gained power and strength, Sinai, Syria in the wake of the turbulences there, Iraq in the wake of the turbulences there, you remember, yes? Libya. Now they are going to Africa and to Indonesia, seizing upon the chaotic situation. Actually, they have, and I'm finishing, actually they have a very systematic strategy, and it is called by them the management of chaos. In Arabic, it's إدارة التوحش. Ashraf. التوحش والفوضى. It means barbarism. Tawahush is from wahsh, barbarism and chaos.
Matti,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ashraf al-Ajrami, if you could address that same question, to what extent is nationalism being eroded by religious radicalism, and what does it mean? The question here says, for Israel's security, what does it mean for Palestine's security?
First of all, I agree with my colleagues about the Islamic movements. The Islamic or religious movements in Islam are parties against nationalism. And what ISIS does today, or are doing today, they destroy the national states. This is the main object of these movements. And I see ISIS as a very negative creature of the regional and international intelligences. This is the main idea, to keep and to increase and to complicate the conflicts in this region, but they want to destroy everything related to the civilization or modernism. This is the main idea, because it is the only way to keep controlling people. Poverty and ignorance is the main object for them to create, to keep control people. And if we are speaking about the Islamic Palestinian movements like Hamas, I just want to remind you that the Israeli Authority encouraged the establishing of the Islamic movement in Gaza Strip in 1979. The only organization had a license to be existed in Gaza Strip by the Israeli occupation authority is the Muslim Brothers movement, which was al-Mujamma al-Islami. And the main object for Israel at that time is to have a movement against the nationalist movement, which is Fatah and PLO, because Israel saw in this movement, the nationalist movement, is a threat and a danger of Israel. So if they want to keep this nationalist movement away, they must create the religious one, which is against the nationalist movement. And I remember in the late 70s and the early 80s, there were clashes between the Islamic movement and the national factions in the Palestinian universities in Gaza and West Bank, because the Islamic movement want to replace the nationalist one, the nationalist one, and to represent the Palestinian people. And if we see the situation nowadays, there is an agreement between the religious nationalist extremist Jewish movements and the extremist Islamic movements. The two want the same thing. They don't want to reach any kind of agreement. They don't want to reach a solution. They want to keep the conflict as the religious one forever. So even if they are in conflict, they are agreed upon one thing. This is what I think they can reach an agreement between them to keep the situation as it, to manage it for a long time. And if you see the program of Hamas or the program of the settlers, the extremist settlers in Israel, the same thing. To keep the situation, to manage the conflict, because it is good. They don't want to have any kind of compromise. They want to give up to the other side. Everything is belonging to us, so we don't want to reach final or permanent solution. We want to keep our power until we won the war. And I think this is the main dangerous thing within this conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians. It will be a religious one. It means that there is no solution, that this is conflict forever. This is the situation. And because of that, I think our duty is to reach a compromise on the national basis, as two national movements to two national or two people. If the two national movements reach an agreement, they can respect the agreement and see as a permanent solution. But in religious cases, if even they reach any kind of agreement, it will be interim agreement until they get what they want. They win the war. And the war, it means we want to have everything. For the Muslims, they see all the land of all the territories, lands of the earth, as belongs to Allah, and they can get what they want on these lands. And I think this is something different in the Jewish case, because they just limited their dreams to the Eretz Israel or Palestine, not for the earth. And for example, for Palestinians, we don't see now ISIS is an enemy of Israel. You don't see until this moment that there is attacks of ISIS against Israel. They don't see Israel as priority for them. The priority is to destroy the Arab and Muslim national countries, states. After that, they can see Israel, they can see other parties. Even in Europe, when the want to do attacks in Europe, it is related to the situation in the Middle East, not in Europe. They don't want to have any kind of change in Europe. They want to change the European attitude towards the conflicts in the region that. But their main object is to have these Islamic states. It is not related to any kind of nationalism or even a specific place. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. Of course, there's a danger in a conference like this where there are not many rabbis represented, there are not many imams represented, and there's a temptation to think that if only people were more like us, we could solve the conflict very quickly. And yet, if you look back over the past 60, 70 years, secular nationalism and nationalists have done a very bad job of resolving this conflict. And if you look back a bit further in centuries, you see that actually religious leaderships were very successful at balancing competing interests of their communities and of their aspirations. And for centuries, they actually found a way of organizing and maintaining an equilibrium through the millet system under the Ottoman Empire. So my question to all the panelists before I throw it open to the floor is, what has gone wrong, if you can sort of cast a historical eye, to produce this very inclusive notion of religious acceptance and overlapping religious authorities in the region to a very exclusive outlook in which the winner takes all? And can they see any prospect for, if not rewinding the clock, at least trying to coin a more tolerant and inclusive religious understanding amongst religious movements in the region?
One comment and one vignette. Let's begin with the vignette, okay? Several years ago, there was a conference in Madrid celebrating 15 years of the original Madrid conference, and they invited all sorts of the original players back, probably about 150 people at the conference. And there was most of them were either Israeli or Arab, Palestinian, or players from the Arab world, and some Christians. We were invited to a reception at the palace of the King and Queen of Spain, one of their medieval palaces. And there's a reception line, we shook hands, and then we were shown into a courtyard, and there were young Spanish soldiers in medieval uniform, dressed men and women, and they began to serve hors d'oeuvres. And a few minutes into the reception, one of my friends from Washington raced over to me and said, "Danny, look, what are they serving?" They are serving the finest Spanish ham. And you have a group of 30 Israelis and 50 Arabs, and they're all eating the ham. Now you know why peace is not at hand. Peace will be at hand when the King of Spain serves ham at a reception to this, and will get stoned by the participants. Now, what was the question again? How did we get to this? Very briefly, we are witnessing trends of religious radicalization globally within Christian communities in the United States and in Europe, certainly in Islam, and also within the Jewish world. So this is not unique. What is unique is that Jerusalem is really where the tectonic plates of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam meet. And it's basically the holy sites of Jerusalem are the physical embodiments of faith. So it becomes something of a lightning rod. Until now, the trends of religious radicalization have been inadequately dealt with by two means primarily. One is the Shin Bet, trying to stop hate crimes, whether it's perpetrated by Jews or Muslims, and not to great effect, and condemnation. And every time there is a hate crime, you will hear condemnations from the heads of churches and the chief rabbinate, etc. But these are grossly inadequate. The radicalization in Jerusalem is particularly fed by two things which are very clearly wanting. One is the lack of any political horizon. For the first time in my memory at least, nobody knows what happens next. There is no prospect for any credible political engagement, no prospect to address the core grievances of occupation. And as a result of that, this is a fertile ground for religious radicalization. Political alternative is one of the best ways of at least mitigating or making the trends of radicalization more subdued. Finally, for many secularists, you combat religious radicalism by convincing people to become atheists. Yeah, right. What is the best and most effective way to combat the religious radicalism is our faith-based alternatives. And they cannot be created out of nothing, but they are available. One of my friends who is very senior in the Latin community in Jerusalem bemoaned to me, we Franciscans and Jesuits are not being thrown out of Jerusalem, we're merely being replaced, we're being marginalized, and the churches that are becoming more important are the evangelical end of days churches. The high ground in the discourse, we are in the middle of a frenzy of mutual denial regarding Jewish and Muslim attachments to the Temple Mount, with Jews denying attachments and challenging that, and there being a Muslim pathology denying any Jewish connection. There is very, very little pushback coming back in the public discourse because we have marginalized those religious groups that recognize the multiple attachments to holy sites in Jerusalem. Final word, the trends of radicalization are going to continue because they're a global phenomenon and Jerusalem is the best place to live that out. They can be combated in more effective ways.
Okay, thank you. Matti, if I could throw the same question open to you. It seems the reason that you have minorities in the Middle East until today is because Islam preserved them in a way that Christendom in the West didn't. How is it that it seems that those inclusive values which characterized Islamic rule for centuries have been lost, and religious movements and now Islamic movements and Jewish movements are projecting an exclusive vision of absolute rule?
What bothers me most is that in the absence of any change of the present paradigm, there will be escalation, and the Palestinian arena will turn into a chaotic state or situation. Chaotic state will invite all the spoilers, including ISIS. They will seize upon the area of barbarism and chaos. For ISIS, I must say, hearing what Ashraf said, for ISIS, Palestine and in its midst, Temple Mount, al-Haram al-Sharif, is very, very important. It is not lip service when they are addressing the issue. The problem of ISIS, for the time being, is that ISIS does not have the force, the operative force, in order to enter into the arena. A chaotic situation will prepare the ground for it. Now, Jerusalem is very important, and Palestine, Jerusalem, and Temple Mount are very important for ISIS, not only because of the past, because the magical journey of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca and Medina to Jerusalem and then to the seventh sky, according to the Islamic tradition. Not because of that, what is called al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. Not only because of that, but because of the future. Because according to the Islamic eschatology, according to the Islamic thinking and traditions about the, let us say, the redemption, Jerusalem and Temple Mount will be the ground, the arena for the final victory of Islam. And if you are so fundamentalist, you believe in it. Not only in the past, but in the future. So it is very important to them. We must do our utmost to prevent it. And the only way to it is stability. And stability can be attained only by a political settlement. Then we will be able, based on the Arab Peace Initiative, to build an Israeli Sunni Islamic coalition against the Shiite threat and the radical Sunni threat. We can achieve it. It's not a dream, but it is based on the finalization of the conflict.
Okay, Matti.
But and another point.
Can we come back to that in questions? Or?
Only a concluding point. From the order of priorities of the Arab and Islamic world has been changed. The main problem is our internal, existential, internal, economic, social, the inner threat of the radicals, while the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been driven to a secondary priority. It is important because we can be a partner to an Arab and Islamic Sunni consensus against the threatening Shia and the threatening Sunnah.
Okay, thank you. Ashraf, the same question in a slightly different form. I mean, are secular Palestinian nationalists and religious nationalists in the form of Hamas, are they destined to continue squabbling and fighting forever? Or is there a way in which they can find a way of bridging their differences?
I think it will be some kind of conflict between the religious movements and the secular and nationalist movements. It's somehow related to the society. Which kind of society the two parties want to see. If we are speaking about politics, they can manage, because the Hamas movement can accept a reality of establishing a Palestinian state based on 1967 borders, even if Hamas won't recognize Israel as any party, but can accept it as a reality, as de facto. But when we speaking about the society, the law, the regime, the Islamic religious movement won't give up their goal to make the society Islamic one and to implement all the Islamic laws on the people. And this is what we see partially in Gaza Strip. But they don't want to change everything because there is a Palestinian basic law which is implemented in Gaza Strip as in West Bank, but they try to have small changes here and there to make this the specific Islamic regime in Gaza Strip. And I think it will be all the time, but they can manage also with the democratic elections. They want democratic elections because they don't like it. They don't believe in it, but they can use it as an instrument to change, to have their change. As, for example, in Turkey, the Islamic party there, they use the democracy and the elections as a part of a change to reach their goal to make the society Islamic one.
Thank you. If we could now throw it open, I think we may only have time for one round of questions, so yeah, please get your thoughts in now. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. If we could start in the front with Mohammed.
Mohammed Amin, my question is for Matti Steinberg. I'm very familiar with what you explain about Hamas and how they regard the whole of Palestine as an Islamic Waqf. My question is, what opinions, if any, have there been from leading Saudi scholars, for example, against that, given that the Saudi government is willing to put forward the Saudi peace initiative?
Next. Over there. Grey jumper.
Thanks. Here, every year on Remembrance Sunday, we remember those who died in the British military, and you often see the crescent moon standing next to the Star of David and the cross. Do you think Israel would have reached a faster solution, or any solution, if there had been a separation of religion and state?
Right, I think we with the Middle East, it's always really been a theocracy rather than democracy. It's the battle with the Amalekites, you know, Jacob and Esau, Isaac and Ishmael. You know, the Holy God of Israel, and Jerusalem will be the throne of the Lord. All the nations will go up to it. And I just think it's going back into those days where we have to see the Middle East as a theocracy, and may the true God win.
Here in the blue shirt. Sorry.
There hasn't been much discussion of extremist Jewish movements, which are being alarmingly ascendant, as you did touch on. And one solution you mentioned for general combating religious extremism was to provide alternate narratives. How can this be done in the current Israeli political system, where moderate or sort of religiously left-wing Jewish voices are increasingly being silenced, such as the Reform movement?
One up and three along.
I was going to ask a very similar question, and in addition, where the impetus for the Jewish extremist movement is coming from, because to me at least, from the UK, it seems like something relatively new, and just how popular and how populist is it in the Israeli political system?
Okay, and one more at the back.
Yes, bearing in mind how much violence there's been with the Syrian civil war over the last 5 years, and there have been far, far more deaths there of Arabs by fellow Arabs than anything that's ever happened in Palestine or Israel. Do you think this makes it more difficult to encourage Israelis to have trust in Arab leaders regarding coming to a peace settlement?
Okay, thank you. Okay. All good questions. How to reconcile the Hamas view of Islamic Waqf over the whole of Palestine with the Saudi-sponsored Arab Peace Initiative. Should we be looking, if you'd had a separation of religion and state, would the Middle East be in a better place? Are we seeing a battle of theocracies? Where does the impetus of Jewish extremism come from, and how can voices which feel they're being silenced, particularly on the left, make themselves heard in the current context? Should we go in the same order? Thank you.
I'd like to address the question of the sources of religious radicalization and what characterizes it by examining something regarding the epicenter, the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif. 4 short vignettes. What was the status quo on the Temple Mount during the British Mandate? There wasn't one. Because the status quo is a term that becomes operative when you have a contested site. The Temple Mount was not a contested site. There were no Jewish claims to do something. There were deep Jewish attachments. But the rabbinate was unanimous. No Jewish visits to the Temple Mount. Fast forward. June 1967, Moshe Dayan arrives at the Temple Mount 4 hours after it falls to the paratroopers and sees Israeli flags flying from the mosques. He barks, take them down and never put them up again. And that was the intuitive decision, created the status quo, which afforded a great deal of autonomy, and this will remain a Muslim site of worship accessible to non-Muslims. Fast forward again, 1980, I'm in the IDF, and I'm a commander of a course of officers, and we had occasion to visit the Temple Mount. I would go to the Temple Mount with a payment voucher book of the IDF. It would be filled out by the Waqf guards in Arabic. I would fill it out in Hebrew. I'd leave 1 copy with them, take 2 copies, and send one to Tel Aviv to get. Now, they didn't like it, but it was respectful, it was dignified, and it was without tension. Last point, fast forward again. Our minister of, former minister of construction minister, I think he's tourism minister now, Uri Ariel, is a member of the cabinet. He has collective responsibility. Every government and every cabinet in Israel has opposed Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. He goes to the Temple Mount, he tells Netanyahu he's going to the Temple Mount, and he prays. Now, you can pray silently from the limited experience I have with God, but no, he's a bit like the ultra-Orthodox. Have you noticed the ultra-Orthodox cannot pray under 30,000 feet on an international flight because it does not sufficiently annoy the other passengers? It is, you need to have aggravated piety. So he does the priestly blessing, and then he goes on camera and says, I would be delighted in my capacity as the Minister of Construction to see the third temple built. He is not satisfied with having a limited audience, so he posts it on Facebook. What we have seen is, in the framework of a technical status quo, we have seen the Temple Mount go from a Muslim site which was not contested into the quintessential contested site, and the Muslim fears are well taken within the framework of the status quo. One of the most important changes that have pulled us back from the brink is Netanyahu has begun to challenge the pyromaniacs in his midst, and he has castigated some of the members of his cabinet for advocating change in the status quo, and that is one of the things that is capable of pulling us back from the brink.
Thank you. Matti. 2 minutes.
Okay. Now to the question of Hamas and the Saudi. I began by saying in the beginning of this session, I spoke about the variety among Islam, the differentiation among Islam. It's not only among Islam, but here you can see a differentiation between even Wahhabi Islam. Now, there is a difference between the interpretation of the Saudis today or since 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative, but you have to recall that the Arab Peace Initiative began as a Saudi initiative, a proper Saudi initiative, and then it turned, in order to get the consensus, the Arab consensus, into the Arab one. So it began as Saudi initiative. Now, here you have different interpretations of Islam. Yes, a different interpretation. And Saudi Arabia gives interpretation of Islam according to the national interest of Saudi Arabia, to its existential interest of Saudi Arabia. And okay, and now about the separation of religion and politics. I think it's a mistake to equate Judaism and Islam with Christianity. Judaism and Islam, politics and religion are bound, are doomed to be bound. Want it or don't want it, this is a fact. What we can achieve is the predominance of the national or politics on religion. This is what we can achieve. I think it will be exaggerated to wait for the separation of politics and religion in order to solve the conflict. We have to solve the conflict, first of all. And then the weight and significance of religion will be reduced. Okay.
Ashraf.
I think it is very important to separate religion from politics. This is the only way to have solutions for all problems. And I think we can't do this before we have settlements for the most problematic issues. For example, the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it somehow can make the region calm down. When I speak about ISIS, the main reason that ISIS all the time succeeded to bring young people to join it is the Palestinian issue, not any issue else. Only the Palestinian issue, only Al-Aqsa, only the Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. So somehow ISIS succeeded to convince people that this is the only way to be a big and strong Islamic movement and the state of Islam, and after that we can liberate all the Islamic Waqf territories, especially Palestine and other places. And if we want to weaken ISIS, not just by force, as the international coalition do in Iraq and Syria and other places, also to find a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, even it can calm down the situation in the region, in Palestine and other. And I think that there is just a remark here that ISIS didn't succeed to enter the Palestinian territories as it wishes, because the Palestinians didn't see ISIS as a struggler movement against Israel, like Hezbollah, for example.
My thanks to all the panelists. It's been a fascinating session. I hope we haven't alienated any religious people who might be in the audience and feel that they've been excluded by our conversation today. But it's been my thanks to Ashraf al-Ajrami, Seidemann, and Matti Steinberg for a very good session.